Okay, so I see you've made it back for chapter 2 of Midnight Children. Chapter 2, in which there is one puddle of blood and 2 escapes. Ravini Foster watched the house across the street while he ate breakfast. He watched it while he refilled his bird feeders around the yard. He watched it out the bathroom window while he brushed his teeth, and all the while the house stood silent. No doors opened, no curtains moved, no faces appeared, no voices rang out. The house looked as empty as it had every day since Mr. Croward had moved away. Finally, Ravini's desperate curiosity could wait no longer. He walked out his front door and across the sunlit street, stomach swirling, took a bracing breath, and moved toward the shadows of the porch. He tiptoed, though he wasn't sure why, creaked up the porch steps, crept past the front door to a big picture window, choked down a dry swallow, and then cupped his hands around his eyes and pressed them up against the glass. The house looked lifeless and vacant. Mr. Croward's dingy furniture was still there, but it looked dusty and unused. "Are you in there?" Ravini whispered. "Or were you just a dream?" He was about to turn and leave when he saw it, hanging on a closet doorknob, a pretty white parasol. Ravini's heart thumped. He smiled. "What are you doing?" The voice startled him, causing him to gasp and jerk away from the window. It hadn't come from a mysterious child, though, but from a confused mother, his own mother, standing in his own yard. "Nothing," he called quickly. He glanced one more time at the parasol, then trudged reluctantly down off the porch. His mother held a metal lunchbox out toward him. "Your father forgot his lunch again." Ravini's mouth went dry. He hated going to his father's work. He opened his mouth to argue, but didn't get the chance. "Your father needs to eat, and I've got laundry to do. Off you go." Ravini groaned and took the lunchbox. His stomach rose to a nervous boil as he crossed the bridge over Carcass Creek. His heart beat a little faster with every step. He tried to lose himself by watching the birds that flew from tree to tree around him. He saw a brown nuthatch, a house finch, and plenty of crows, but far too soon he was there, looking up at the great steel building that was the sinister slaughterhouse. Ravini gulped. The slaughterhouse growled and clanked with dark noises. Inside, the machinery of death whirled and cranked and hissed. Conveyor belts, bolt guns, pneumatic blades. To one side stood the muddy fence with lots where the cows waited, standing ankle deep in the muck, staring out at him. He couldn't meet their eyes. One of them mooed hopelessly. He wasn't sure what it was saying. Help, perhaps. At the back of the lot was a ramp leading into the building. A pair of brawny men shouted and waved their arms, herding the poor beast in one by one. On the other side of the building, the truck stood ready. Sinister quality meats, emblazoned on their sides, pallets of white paper wrapped packages being loaded into them. Packages stamped, Ravini knew, with grisly labels: ground chuck, spare ribs, rump roast, beef tongue. Ravini was glad it wasn't veal day. He couldn't see inside the building. The only windows were small and very high up, but he knew what happened inside. Everyone did. The cows went in, breathing and thinking and feeling, and meat came out. Ravini shuddered, and then he walked up toward the front door. With each step, the noise grew louder, and Ravini's stomach queasier. The sounds from inside got clearer. Violent whooshes and gruesome ka-chunks and pitiable moos that made his hands break out in greasy sweat. A moist buzzing that could only be an electric saw blade cutting through bone. And beneath it all, a dark pattern like a drumbeat. A hiss, then a startled moo that cut off abruptly with a meaty thud. Hiss, moo, thud. Hiss, moo, thud. Hiss, moo, thud. Ravini's felt shuddered to a stop on the gravel walkway. In the pen, now only a stone throw away, a cow stood with its head sticking out through the fence. It looked at Ravini with pleading eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Hiss! Moo! Thud!" the cow sighed. Beside the door was the bulletin board papered with reminders and announcements for the workers. "Step carefully. Floor may be slippery, and it's been 3 days since our last accident. And support our town. Eat more meat." And in the middle, a flyer that Ravini had already seen posted all over town. 50th Annual Red River Raft Race. 4th of July at sunset. Open to all Slaughtervillians, 12 and under. $100 prize. Beneath the words was a silhouette of 2 kids paddling a boat, mouths open wide in gleeful grins. Ravini frowned. Then he pushed open the door and walked inside. Before the killing floor, there was an office. In the office were some impressively full bookcases, several filing cabinets, a gigantic dark wood desk, and the man who sat behind it, frowning at some papers in his hand. Mr. Strugus Sinister himself, owner and operator of Sinister Quality Meats, as well as the local judge. The room Ravini stood in doubled as both slaughterhouse headquarters and occasional courtroom. On the wall behind the desk was a large framed painting of a black-suited, thick-necked man who looked almost identical to Mr. Sinister, except for the grim sternness in his eyes. Ravini knew it was Strayhorn Sinister, founder of the Sinister Quality Meats and grandfather of the man currently occupying the desk. "Young Mr. Foster," Mr. Sinister boomed in a deep baritone. "Father forgot his lunch again?" "Yes, sir. Sorry to bother you." No, don't be silly." As usual, Mr. Sinister seemed eager for an interruption to his work. There was, thankfully, no window to the killing floor in the office, but the thin walls made the sounds within even louder and more immediate. Hiss, moo, thud. Mr. Sinister grimaced, then looked to the lunchbox in Ravini's hand. "What did your mother pack today, if you don't mind me asking?" Ravini set the lunchbox on Mr. Sinister's desk and swung it open. "Empanadas," he said, and at Mr. Sinister's squint, he explained, "They're like little pies with savory stuffing." Ravini picked up one of the flaky crusted pastries and handed it to Mr. Sinister. "She put one in for you." Mr. Sinister's eyes shining, licked his lips and took it eagerly. "Like a little calzone. What's inside?" Ravini looked at the ceiling, trying to remember what his mother had told him. Leek and sweet potato with garlic and roasted jalapeno." "No meat?" "No meat." Mr. Sinister shook his head, but more with wonder than disappointment. "Imagine that, a meal with no meat. How curious. Tell her thank you for me." "Yes, sir." "What did you bring?" Ravini asked, looking at Mr. Sinister's own lunchbox also sitting on his desk. "Oh, spaghetti with meatballs, of course." His eyes dimmed a bit. 80% ground beef chuck, 20% ground pork. Hiss, moo, thud. "But I made the marinara sauce. I made the marinara myself." "Slow simmered with tomatoes from our garden and plenty of basil and parmesan. Old family recipe." "Sounds great, Mr. Sinister." Ravini clicked his father's lunchbox closed, then eyed the door to the killing floor. He wasn't eager to go inside. His smooth thud. Mr. Sinister saw Ravini's glum glance at the killing floor door. He tucked his lips in understanding, looking at the door with almost as much distaste as Ravini felt. "I know, son. Just keep your head down and stay behind the yellow line. Try not to look anything in the eye." Ravini sighed, and he was just turning toward the killing floor door when he was interrupted by the main door slamming open behind him. His blood ran cold when he saw who had come in. Ravini's face went pale as the other boy sneered. "Hey, Ravioli, The boy's voice was greasy with great globs of gloat. "Bringing your father's lunch as well, Mr. Carter?" Mr. Sinister asked with a small frown. Donnie Carter nodded, still smirking at Ravini. On the other side of the wall, the horrid sounds fell silent. "Ah, perfect lunch break," Mr. Sinister said, with a little nod to Ravini. "You're much less likely to be splattered. Go on, then. I'm sure your fathers are hungry." Ravini shot nervous eyes at Donnie, who flashed a sharp smile back at him. "After you, Ravioli." Ravini turned miserably and pushed open the wooden door to the killing floor. He could practically feel Donnie's hot breath on the back of his neck. Ravini kept his head down and his eyes pasted to the cement floor at his feet. There was a yellow line on the floor that ran along the brick wall, marking the path that was out of the reach of swinging caracas and slashing blades. Ravini walked quickly beside the line. He took quick, shallow breaths through his mouth. He wasn't sure whether the stench of the killing floor was blood or guts or just the smell of death, but he was sure that it was revolting. He scurried quickly, trying to stay ahead of Donnie Carter, but it was no use. The brute was right at his back, close enough to hiss foul words into Ravini's ears. "What's the matter, Ravioli? Too much blood for you? Too scary? Make you want to cry for little cows?" He poked Ravini's shoulder with a rough finger. "Ooh, look at that one. It looks like it got turned inside out." Ravini did not look at that one, or at anything other than the floor at his feet. He grimaced and stepped over a glistening crimson puddle that had spread across the yellow line. He was nearly to the corner of the building. He'd take a left there, and then the lunch benches would be on the little alcove straight ahead, and freedom within grasp. He allowed a flicker of hope to kindle in his hammering heart. "Alas, watch your step," Donnie growled, and then kicked at Ravini's hurrying legs. One foot tangled behind the other. A more athletic child might have been able to recover, to regain their balance, and shoot Donnie a dirty look. But Ravini Foster was not a more athletic child. In all of Slaughterville, in fact, it would be hard to find a less athletic child. He went sprawling to the floor. His breath flew out of him with a grunt, and he slid on the slick cement across the yellow line. He felt a warm moistness on his chest. His right hand still clutched the handle of the lunch tin, but his left hand was gripping something furry. Ravini screwed one eye shut and slowly raised his forehead from the floor, and immediately wished he hadn't. His fingers were closed around the leg of a cow, or rather, most of the leg of a cow. A hoof, a length of scratchy brown fur, and then a rather abrupt and meaty ending. Ravini gagged and jumped to his feet, gasping. Donnie had already walked past him, chorting and snorting. "Oops, you got a little something on your shirt, Ravioli." Ravini looked down. The front of his shirt was stained with a smear of dark red blood. Well, mostly blood. There was also a few brown bits that he tried not to focus on. "I hope it's brains," he thought miserably, considering the other options. He stood for a moment, focusing on keeping his breakfast in his belly. It wasn't the first time an encounter with Donnie had left him gasping and bloody. At least this time it wasn't his own blood. He blinked away the tears that had sprung in his eyes and then continued walking. He came around the corner. He saw the slaughterhouse crew gathered on the benches in the little side room at the back. Bloody coveralls and chewing mouths and slouched shoulders and a low hubbub of gruff talk. Ravini spotted the muscly bulk of his father sitting with a few others on the nearest bench. The floor foreman, Carl Carter, Donnie Carter's dad, sat next to him, and Donnie was already strutting up to them. Ravini saw his father's eyes look past Donnie and find him, saw them drop down to the mess on his shirt. He looked quick to Donnie, then back to Ravini. Ravini wanted to meet his gaze, to be as strong as his father for once, but shame filled his eyes again and he looked away. As Ravini walked up, he heard Mr. Carter's deep wheeze of a voice. "You're late, Donnie. Been working on your boat, yeah?" "Yes, sir," Donnie answered, all the smirk gone from his voice. He was a considerably smaller person when he was around his father, Ravini had noticed. "You gonna win again this year, Donnie," another worker called out. "Course he is," Mr. Carter said. "3 in a row, just like his old man. And he knows if he don't, he's sleeping in the hen house." He said it like a joke, and it was met with the roar of expected laughter from the crew, but Donnie's smile looked strained. Mr. Carter noticed Ravini standing there. A glint came to his eyes. "Ah, your boy's here too, Foster. He's going to be racing this year?" Carl Carter never seemed to speak to Ravini directly. Excuse me. Ravini's father looked at him. "I don't know," he said in a quiet voice. "Are you, son?" Ravini imagined tossing out a boast, saying, "Course I am, and I'm going to give Donnie a run for his money," with a wink and a reckless grin. Every child in Slaughterville lived for the Red River Raft Race every year and lay awake at night dreaming about the glory of being crowned champion in front of the whole town. Every child except Ravini. He hadn't raced in it last year or the year before, and he wasn't going to be racing it this year either, because the Red River Raft Race was not a solo race. To race, you needed a boat and a friend. Ravini Foster didn't have either. Ravini said, eyes darting from his father to Mr. Carter, his words caught in his throat. "I don't," Mr. Carter's brow furrowed. He cocked an eyebrow at Ravini's father. "Well, is he or ain't he? What kind of boy wouldn't want to race? Ain't he going to try and beat the reigning champion?" He slapped Donnie on the shoulder hard enough to nearly knock him down. Ravini opened his mouth to answer, saw his father's frown, and looked down to the floor. Ravini just shook his head. "Well," Mr. Carter said, smirking, "probably for the best. Wouldn't want to see him get hurt." He turned and started talking to the rest of the crew, his arm around Donnie's shoulder. Ravini walked up to his father and held out the lunch tin. "Thanks, son." The words were murmured quiet. "What happened to your shirt?" Ravini couldn't meet his father's eyes, so he looked at the big man's knuckles, his blood-splattered coveralls, the blurry muscles of his arms, the solid square sturdiness of his size 13 boots. He was so much more in every way than Ravini, it seemed. "I fell," he said. True words, more or less, maybe less. His father sighed and nodded. Ravini kept his eyes down. Being a disappointment to his father was not a new feeling. "Go on home," his father murmured, and Ravini glanced up to see his father looking at Donnie, still grinning at his father's crew. Now was Ravini's chance to leave alone, and his father knew it. He knew who was the cow and who was the butcher. "Yes, sir," Ravini mumbled, and then he made his escape. Once outside, he looked at the empty road, then he looked at the woods. If he walked home through the woods, he'd have to walk right through the crowded yard. He could peer perhaps through windows, find perhaps hiding children. He was halfway to the tree line when he saw the cow. The same one, standing at the fence, watching him with begging eyes. Ravini stopped, and then for reasons that he wouldn't have been able to explain, Ravini chose to walk over to the doomed and lonesome animal. Stories, after all, are about choices. The cow watched his approach, his ears perked up. Ravini stopped in front of the condemned creature. He put his hand on the barbed wire and looked into his eyes. There was a sparkle there, a warmth. The cow was a deep chestnut brown all over, but with a white blaze on its forehead that was in the unmistakably shape of a clover leaf. A clover leaf that, if Ravini squinted right, seemed to have 4 leaves. Ravini knew what it would have named the cow if it had been his. "Hello, Lucky," he said quietly. The cow's breath was warm on Ravini's hand. The cow was trapped in a sad place where monsters lurked with seemingly no hope of salvation. "You and me are more alike, Lucky," Ravini whispered. "Maybe we should be friends." Lucky poked her head through the fence. She rested her velvet chin on Ravini's hands. She blinked her long eyelashes. When two lonely souls find each other, sometimes there is a reaching out. Ravini swallowed, feeling all the things that a soul feels when it makes a friend it knows it's going to have to lose. But then Ravini saw Lucky wasn't just standing by the fence. She was standing by a gate. The gate was closed with a latch, but there was no lock. Cows, after all, couldn't open gates. Ravini looked around quickly. There was no one in sight. His hand reached for the latch and then froze. It was an incredibly stupid thing to do. He would be in serious trouble. His father could lose his job. But then he looked again into Lucky's eyes. A choice was made. A mistake, perhaps, but a choice to be sure. Ravini undid the latch. He swung the gate open, cringing at the creak of the hinges. Lucky looked at the path to freedom, then back to Ravini. "Go on!" Sometimes a soul, when it sees a chance to have what it's always wanted, doesn't have the courage to seize it. That cow, though, did have the courage. Or maybe she was just bored. It's hard to tell with cows. She walked out through the gate, past Ravini, and over toward the shade of trees by the creek. Its hooves a quiet thunder in a muddy turf. "Good luck," Ravini whispered, then closed the gate and hurried into the shadowy safety of the forest. He glanced back once and saw the cow grazing in the long grass. It wouldn't make a difference in the long run, he knew. The cow wouldn't wander far, and they'd probably find her in a few minutes. But it was, Ravini figured, better than nothing. At least this way, the cow could enjoy a little bit of freedom before being turned inside out. And that was chapter 2. So come back for chapter 3 to see what happens. I hope Lucky gets away.